Hello and a very warm welcome indeed to Quadriga, where the focus is on the G20 Summit that Germany is hosting this weekend in Hamburg. It brings together the world's leading industrialised and emerging economies, but what can it achieve? Well, even before the summit has begun, there's been protests. G20 critics, and there are plenty of them, say it's just another talking shop. They say it's failed so far on issues like global inequality, climate change and bringing sustained growth to Africa. But are they right? Well, our question this week on Quadriga is G20 Summit problem or solution? And to discuss that question, I'm joined in the studio by Mekonnen Mesghena, a specialist in migration and diversity with the Heinrich Böll Foundation here in Berlin. Mekonnen says trade, development, migration and refugees are all on the agenda in Hamburg, but Africa, with its 1.2 billion people, is almost absent. It verges, he says, on neo-colonialism. Also with us is Irwin Collier, economics professor at the John F. Kennedy Institute at Berlin's Free University, who argues it's better to have a regular forum like this for coordinating responses to shared problems than to wait until crises build up and become manifest. And a warm welcome also goes to Dagmar Dehmer, who writes on development and environmental issues and Africa with the Berlin-based daily Der Tagesspiegel. Dagmar says the G20 want companies to invest more in Africa, but private money cannot solve the institutional problems so prevalent on the African continent. Thank you once again, all three of you, for being with me here today on Quadriga. I'd like to begin with you, Professor Collier. And the prominent Swiss sociologist Jean Ziegler gave a fiery interview this week here in Germany, in which he said, talking of the G20, scrap it, get rid of it for good. It's totally illegitimate and illegal. From your quote at the top of the show, I guess you don't entirely agree with him.
Well, I think, if we didn't have a G20, we would be inventing something looking like a G25, a G15, for precisely the same things. Crises occur. They seem to be occurring with astonishing regularity. And, I will stand by my statement that you need to get people together when there's a common global problem. And having this as an annual exercise is probably not such a bad idea, rather than responding ad hoc as conditions warrant. I think a regular meeting, it's neither problem nor solution. It's what's between. You see a problem, you try to figure out what solutions. It's not the solution.
But what we've ended up with, after what you say, all fair and good, what we've got is 10,000 people involved in the summit, many of them politicians, many of them journalists. We've got 20,000 police, somewhere between 100 and 200,000 demonstrators. All this in the heart of Hamburg. It's a recipe for it's madness.
It's not a recipe for the agora and of informed debate on all sides. What you're going to have is a lot of different fora where the debates will be taking place. And I think it does help, as long as things remain nonviolent, so that does not become the sideshow that distracts everybody, that a principled protest on issues that are not on the agenda, and also the debate about who should be there when and under what circumstances, all are perfectly legitimate ways of conducting international business. But to have a core of players that are maybe, thinking of the financial crisis, too big to fail, playing a key role, or whose cooperation is absolutely essential, if you need their cooperation, you have to include them from the very beginning.
OK, Mekonnen Mesghena, I'm interested to hear what you have to say. Hamburg's mayor, Olaf Scholz, he came out this week and he said, this is not the time for a breakdown in dialogue on crucial issues like war, persecution, climate change and free trade. His message is clearly, like Professor Collier's, we have to keep channels of dialogue open. Do you agree?
Definitely. I mean, we need to keep channels of dialogue, but the issue is who is sitting on the table. Either you are part of the dialogue or you will be on the menu. And that's what happens when we look...
Either you are part of the dialogue or you are on the menu.
Exactly. And
that sounds threatening.
And then that's what happens these days, for example, when we look at the continent, African continent, that which is rightly on the agenda of the debate, and most of the issues on the agenda are correct. Most probably too many agenda, too many topics. I'm not quite sure if it's possible to tackle all these issues. So it's not about the issues, it's not about the agenda, but the problem is about the stakeholders. So who is affected by those issues, and who is sitting on the table, and who is excluded.
You're talking specifically about Africa. This point that I had in your quote at the top of the show: 1.2 billion people, one representative at the table, just one.
Exactly.
And that makes you angry.
Except South Africa. So a number of countries who may be quite relevant, like Nigeria and Algeria and Ethiopia, Kenya, etc., with a huge number of population, but also relevant from the perspective of climate, producing refugees, but also corruption. There are a number of issues which need to be tackled and discussed with these countries, and all these countries are absent. They are not invited. So, yes, we need channels of dialogue. Yes, we need a forum. But who is sitting on the table? That's the issue.
Dagmar, in the past there's been a lot of criticism of the G20 that it hasn't had real leadership, that it hasn't had a real convincing agenda, especially on the kind of issues that you've already mentioned. Angela Merkel seems to be sort of the feeling that we have is that Angela Merkel wants to change that. She wants to give this gathering leadership and an agenda. That's ambitious. Is she going to succeed?
She's going to succeed, except Donald Trump. I mean, it just depends on his mood, if anything comes out of it or not. It has nothing to do with any basis of discussion. And that, of course, makes it a wild card which cannot be calculated at all. That makes it very difficult. And actually, I would not wish the Nigerian president, who is not governing right now because his vice president had to take over, to sit at the same table with Donald Trump and arguing about issues of Africa, which he never even knew where exactly it is. I mean, this is a leader which really makes it difficult to make discussions work. But with the others, it is possible, and with the others, there's a dialogue ongoing. And of course, with parts of society in the US, the dialogue is ongoing too. The point is that the G20 summits are a culmination point at which civil society, science, business, and whatever have a dialogue ongoing in 20 major countries with very different cultures. And they all had to learn to really find a way to talk to each other and find out what their issues are. And that actually is useful. If the outcome of the summit will be useful, we will see. I mean, most of the summit decisions had no real implementation phase, so that might not be the main issue. Maybe the main issue is that leaders have to talk about climate change, although they normally don't. And at UN summits, they might not join.
Well, I have a lot of sympathy to what you say, who is sitting, I mean, what kind of governance is going to sit on the table. But the reality is we should be very careful in not having a double standard, because we cannot choose who is sitting on the table at the end of the day. I mean, we have a number of autocrats who are part of the G20. So, yes, definitely good governance is extremely important, and in Africa it lacks a lot of good governance, but we cannot exclude them because there are autocrats. Otherwise, we need to exclude a number of those participants of G20 as well.
I think we want to separate the G20 as an institution of recurring getting together and any particular meeting. With this one, you brought up the elephant in the room, Donald Trump. We have a major shift we can see towards protectionism as a major shock threatening the world global trading system, which would be of great possibility of opportunity for African development, among other things. A trade war would do us no good. And then we had basically a consensus on climate at a global level that is now being challenged too. And I just simply look, when you've got those two major threats to the global standards, that other issues that would be on the agenda under normal times fall down. Now, what do you do in such circumstances? Sometimes you kick a can down the road, and I suspect this is going to be as much of what Angela Merkel and other people are going to try to do. Essentially, an empty G20 is not the worst thing that could happen. Launching the first shot in a trade war would be something that would be very bad coming out of this.
Okay, interesting stuff. Before we proceed, I mean, I would like to come back to the protesters. A lot of them are arriving in Hamburg. I've quoted the figure, you know, with 100,000, 200,000, we really don't know. Let's just listen for a moment to what some of them have been saying.
I think that in Hamburg we have to show that politics should focus on peace and more fairness in world trade.
The G20 states are causing trouble around the world. They're the world's biggest weapons manufacturers. We are dead set against the violence that these states represent.
The politicians' agenda is too weak. They're going to make a lot of empty promises, and they're not going to use all the options that are available.
Dagmar Dehmer, on the one hand, we've got 20,000 police, we've got barbed wire fences. On the other hand, we've got protest groups. I've written down what their slogans are. G20 not welcome, Hamburg shows attitude, or welcome to hell. Who are the good guys and who are the bad guys?
That is really hard to tell.
Yeah, well, come on then.
Actually, it's almost impossible to separate them from each other because, of course, they live from each other too. So it's really hard to say. I think the best guys were those who had their demonstration last weekend, and that's about it. They brought up their topics and were a bit on the water, and it was a nice demonstration. All the other demonstrations will not be so nice. I'm quite sure about that.
Are you surprised about the sheer number of protesters that are turning out here?
Well, I think they're becoming events sort of a Woodstock nature, or the Grateful Dead, the Deadheads kind of showing up and going from protest to protest. There is a core that this is the political performance that they want. I don't know if that brings us very close to an informed debate, an important debate, to get things on the agenda. But if anyone's going to get it right, I certainly hope Germany is able to show the right amount of tolerance for people when they're going and skirting the edges of public order.
OK, before Mekonnen.
Well, I mean, it's a mixture of everything, of course. I mean, we had a number of G10s and 20s summits in Canada and elsewhere with a massive protest in Italy, I remember. So what I think is a number of people have a clear agenda, political agenda, legitimate political agenda, alternative summits, etc. But of course, you have also people who see these summits as an event to demonstrate their discontent with the state, with police, etc., etc. So it's a mixture. Why it's very hard to find a clear position towards the whole culture of protest. But I think the majority of the people have a legitimate issue to put on because they are not satisfied with the way how the summits goes so far. Not only this one, but also the past summits.
OK, let's get concrete. For Angela Merkel, one item on which the success of the Hamburg summit will hinge is what's called the Compact for Africa. It's also being labelled the Merkel Plan by some African leaders, and the idea is that a sum of initially 300 million euros is supposed to go to reform-oriented African states, so-called reform champions, in order to help them attract international investments. What would you say? Tell us more about this plan for Africa, this compact with Africa. What does it amount to? Because it's being talked up, but it's very difficult to pin down.
I'm glad that Angela Merkel put Africa on the agenda. By the way, also Obama put it without happening nothing. So I mean, we had a number of initiatives which put Africa on the focus of such summits, fortunately with no result. And I'm glad it happens. There is a clear motive behind that. We have to be very frank and open that migration is one of those driving issues, why Angela Merkel and the European Union is also interested in finding solutions in Africa in order to keep refugees and immigrants away.
That's what critics say. They say it's a cynical attempt to keep as many as 100 million Africans in the foreseeable future, keep them away from Europe.
Yes, we should be very open in that motive. And I mean, a state has every legitimate motive. And if Europe and Germany is interested in at least keeping the number of refugees and immigrants lower, it's a legitimate interest. The issue is a plan for what? I mean, we are planning an economic and trade investment climate primarily for what? For whom? I mean, is that for the economy, for the industry here, or is that for the benefit of the majority of Africans? What is the perspective for the people and for development? So, which means trade and economy is not equal to development.
Mm-hmm. This is the point that you were making at the top of the show in your quote. Yes. Can you elucidate for us?
I make another example that shows what I mean. In Paris, we had an initiative for in renewable energies, which should be invested in Africa. 3 billion euro. And now the government, who gave 2 billion, has no idea where the money goes. They just had had to answer questions of the Green Party, and they have no idea how the program works. And that is exactly how it normally goes, you know? You put something up, and yes, you always say private money needs to go in because there's not enough public money to change the course. Of course, that is true. And then the private money goes in or does not go in because the private companies don't feel safe. And as long as they don't feel safe because of institutional mess in many countries, they just don't go there. That means that only countries with some kind of institutions qualify for that compact for Africa. And that is not the countries most in need, in fact.
And the other thing is, of course, 300 million euro sounds quite high number. And
it's not a lot of money.
It is fine. It's also a high number. But look what remittances, what refugees and immigrants really invest in those countries without being visible to any of those economies. This is simply a peanut towards what really people who are from Africa, who came as refugees, as immigrants, are exactly reinvesting in those countries and societies.
How worried are you that it seems to be like a reward scheme for good behaviour from Africans that are sort of almost patted on the head for getting it right? You know, you've used the C word already, colonialism. Does this smack of neo-colonialism?
Well, I mean, there's a test of neocolonialism when you try, first of all, when you draft, when you design a kind of policy and development aids without having the counterparts on your table. So this is, you know, it remembers me at a conference which was very unfamous during some centuries ago, exactly. So I don't want to compare that because I know that there are clear reasons to put that agenda. But on the other side, having a pre-conference where African leaders and where African countries were represented, but not at the core summit, you know, this is not the correct way. So having a preliminary conference with African leaders is fine. But it should be something like, work out your position, work out your agenda, and come and join us and bring your issues and let's tackle those issues. And this is not happening. That's my critique.
OK, well, I'll bring you in just a second, Irwin Collier. I just want to move on to another key issue at the Hamburg summit. It's climate change. Angela Merkel wants to make progress on climate change, on combating global warming. The problem is, we've had it already, Donald Trump is in the room, and, you know, what influence is that going to have? Let's just refresh our memories about how he shunned the Paris agreement not too long ago, just a couple of weeks ago, really.
As president, I have one obligation, and that obligation is to the American people. The Paris Accord would undermine our economy, hamstring our workers, weaken our sovereignty, impose unacceptable legal risk, and put us at a permanent disadvantage to the other countries of the world. It is time to exit the Paris Accord.
Professor Collier, Angela Merkel's got a problem. She wants to get the G20 members to recommit to their Paris commitments explicitly here in Hamburg, but she's got Donald Trump in the room, as we've said. How does she manage that situation? How does she square the circle?
Direct confrontation here is probably not the thing to do. It will just provoke more of the same. Like I said, I think here establishing principles, speaking to the principles, getting enough of the other leaders on record saying that this is here, it's not going away, and perhaps thinking of in a slightly different, a much different context. Stalin did say the Hitlers come and go, the German people remain. I think having a longer-term perspective is what Angela Merkel is showing here. Trump's days are limited. There is hope for the climate change, and it simply means everybody has to continue supporting that in any local way they can, but to expect to have leverage over the United States under the present circumstances is simply unrealistic.
Okay, Dagmar Dehmer, what do you say?
I see it very similar, but I think it might be possible to put in some issues that combat climate change without calling it that. And the man doesn't read, so maybe he will, in the end, find it okay to say a bit more efficiency, why not? And actually, he cannot really change the tide. I mean, renewable energies are much cheaper than coal, and he cannot really subsidize against that. I mean, he can try, but then his small state he wants will probably be bankrupt very fast.
Mekonnen, how to deal with Donald Trump?
Well, I mean, the partner of German politics is the American people. So the American economy, and not definitely the president. So I mean, it's absolutely true that we need to think in longer terms, and if there is any alternative to what is on the agenda of technology, technology advance, etc., and the U.S. economy will be highly engaged and interested in investing as well. So I mean. Yes, there is a kind of disruption at this time because you need the U.S. government and the U.S. president in order to have a global dialogue and agenda. But if there is this disruption for the next 4 years, hopefully not longer than 4 years, we should think in other terms, but especially also look into partnership within the U.S. economy and within the U.S. people.
Okay, we're running out of time, I'm afraid. I would like to give each of you like half a minute, a minute tops, to just... A lot of the protesters are calling for a different kind of globalisation. Define what that different kind of globalisation could look like.
I think globalisation has also helped to fight poverty on the one hand, but on the other side, it has been also gapping the difference between the rich and the poor. So we need a globalization of human rights, a globalization of good governance and democracy, which are clear fundaments and bases for development and economic prosperity.
Okay, Irwin Collier?
I think I'm going to go along very similar. The harmonization is always looked at in terms of financial markets, safety, labor markets, but a harmonization of political standards that we all hold ourselves to report to. I think that is the kind of globalization I would like to see.
Dagmar?
Yeah, globalization of the core values of, as you said, human rights, at least the basic human rights. I think that is not too much to ask for.
Mm-hmm. And when we come back to the question that we began the show with, the summit, the G20 summit in Hamburg, is it going to be... is it a problem or is it a solution? Well, what would you say, Dagmar?
Actually, it's both, and that is how politics
I thought you were going to say that. I thought you might well say that. Mekonnen?
In fact, we have very relevant stakeholders on the table, and we need them in order to move the agenda and also to make change. At the same time, they're of course blocking a lot of developments because they are driven by their interest, by their national interest. So it's not only Donald Trump who says America first, but everybody is thinking, be it China or Russia or Germany even, driven by their own interest.
Okay.
I think Europe has an incredible opportunity here to establish a moral leadership.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much for all three of you for joining me here on Quadriga. Thank you for joining me too. If you've enjoyed the show as much as I have, come back next week. Until then, bye-bye and cheers.